So, what inspired you to start a business focused on working with Gen Z?
I spent about 15 years of my initial part of my career in financial services, and I always said to myself that when I returned back to India, I said I will do just about anything, but run as far as I could from teaching, training, consulting, leadership, because I had my dad, of course, who was in it and very well renowned, and he traveled as much. But I just somehow there was this thing in my mind that okay, if you cannot succeed anywhere else, is this is what you do, but sometimes the old saying, life is what happens to you when you're busy planning what to do with it, right? And so I poured into education in some way. And 2007, I really got a good opportunity to build leadership solutions for a company that I eventually headed. And in 2020, just before COVID, I lost my father. So in 2020, immediately, and there's a big vacuum in my life. And I think there was this gushing emotion to do something in honor of him, and so I think the first idea was to just write a book. And obviously, I hadn't written as much, so I took a course. I had written small articles, and so one was the dedication to my parents, late parents, but also what can I write, which is a little more future thinking, futuristic. So there's plenty written on Gen Y and other generations and leadership books. I mean, there's plenty out there. And so I said that, okay, if I were to write something, what can I write which could be more like a memoir for what I've seen? And that's how the journey began. And with absolutely no expectation that, I'm going to try and build something from here. It was just, as we say, something sometimes you try small and you don't know where it leads you, right? And so that's how it began. And so the book slowly grew, and I was getting a fair number of invitations to talk on Gen Z. It was my first attempt. So I really looked at how does the Gen Z generation learn? Because I had two Gen Z boys at the time spending all their time on a device learning at the time, thanks to COVID. I also looked at, okay, what can companies do to onboard a young talent? And that was a big issue. There was also every company was grappling with. And then, of course, the last piece of the book is talking about how can marketeers look at Gen Z. So it was a little general book. I wish it wasn't very specific, because before I started writing, I saw that there was perhaps a book in each of these categories by experts, and largely written in the Western context. Um, and before 6 months, I was invited by TED again to give a talk on Gen Z. So I think it grew, and the more I started sort of kind of building on it, and I learned perhaps more after the book. Not to say that I'm some deep expert, but I think the more clients were asking me, "Hey, can you do this? Can you think about this? What about this?" Right? I think you dove deeper, and what I found. Ayush, is that I think the challenges and opportunities in a country like India, where the demographics are so complex and so heterogeneous, there was a room to play at four different buckets, if you will, where we could make an impact. One was at the schools. So a lot of the Gen Z population, just by the age bracket, right? There's a large number which are in the school. So India is a fairly young country, right? You've got I don't know, close to more than 40% of the population below the age of 30%. So that's a large number of people who are very young. So either Gen Zs or millennials or Zennials, as they call it. So you have the schooling system that where you can make an impact. You have the university system where you can make an impact. You obviously have the workplace where a fresh 21, 22-year-old is just entering the workforce. And then you obviously have an impact that you can make at home as a parent. And so for each of these, the idea was that how do we take training modules, take webinars, take master classes to sensitize the educators in some cases, to the professors in some cases, to the managers who are managing Gen Zs, right? And that's how it began. And much of my work is in the space of the corporate landscape, where a lot of the managers are kind of onboarding young Gen Zs. But these are the four areas where I saw a huge amount of opportunity. I think three of the four are untapped, but the fourth one is where I'm kind of putting some of my energy.
Yeah, let's touch on that fourth one. So, what are some of the key insights you've gained about Gen Z's workplace behavior in corporate settings?
Yeah. So again, as just to help our viewers and listeners, there are 5 generations as per the experts that are there, or maybe even 7 if you consider. So which are those generations? So there's the silent generation, boomer, you have Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z. And then of course there's Gen Alpha, which is after Gen Z, and there's one preceding the silent generation, which is called the GI generation. Anyway, most of these have, depending upon which research think tank you look at, they will kind of categorize them depending on which years you're born, right? But largely it's defined by a certain time where there were certain events everybody could relate to. And most companies today, Ayush, will likely have at least 3 generations in the workplace. So you're talking about Gen X, which are somewhere on the 39 to 55 age bracket. Okay, you got Gen Ys, where so much is written about them, and they're probably in their 40s, the eldest of the Y. And the Gen Z would be between 1997 to 2012. So the eldest of the Gen Z is somewhere around 26 or so, right? Now, each generation brings its context. And so I think that drives the behavior and drives the opportunity as well as the challenge. So what I'm seeing is you got companies with minimum 3 generations, but in some instances, you're seeing 4 generations at play, right? I mean, if you look at LinkedIn, more and more people are working longer. And so you see that each generation brings a different behavior at the workplace, right? So if you're a boomer, let's just look at India as an example. Like people in that generation were just coming out of independence, as India was gaining independence, fewer jobs, very low literacy, and therefore their context was, hey, if you got a job, hold on to it. And doesn't matter, just keep that job and go through it. Gen X and Gen Y and Gen Z had a different context. So but in terms of what we see at the workplace, why this is important is that your foundational years have an impact on your values, your beliefs, and that in turn have an impact on your behavior, which is what you bring to work. So if you look at the boomer generation, by and large, right, what's the impression that people say? Hey, they're hardworking, they have a respect for hierarchy, they really just want to be appreciated. If you think about the Generation X, they're largely the generation which is first generation, which is really seriously thinking about work balance, because that was the generation where more and more of the people in that bracket were actually doing global roles and working in multiple time zones, and you had two parents working at the same time, and the kids were sort of alone. So I think the whole concept of work-life balance probably gained a little bit of mainstream recognition from that generation. Gen Y and Gen Z are the 2 generations where you saw again, that's the first generation which started putting, themselves online. But what defined them? So if we compare the 2 generations, which are largely talked about, Y and Z, is that okay? And the Y generation was very happy to reveal themselves online, right? They were always wanting feedback. They wanted to be engaged. And they wanted a diversity in terms of their workload and so on. If you look at the Gen Z, contrary to what a lot of people say that, hey, there are lots and lots of similarities, I'd say there are some similarities, but they're still very distinctively different, right? So the Gen Z is different from the point of view that they're also equally tech savvy or more tech savvy, but they're tech savvy, but they also have a different view of the online now with cyber security and privacy and hacking and all things that are happening the dark side of the web, right? So you hear that. So they have a slightly different view of how they see their digital footprint online. So that's one. They're much more entrepreneurial. There's enough stories. I mean, I see certainly in the Indian context, you see that there's an aspiration to do something on your own and so on. So again, that's just the context setting, Ayush. Now, in terms of the behavior, what we see is that I always say each generation can learn from each other. So when you think about the Gen Z, there's a stereotype for every generation, right? If you put, hey, which is the most narcissistic generation in Google, and you'll see everything from millennials will pop up, right? So likewise with Gen Z, I think a lot of the work that I've seen that, again, very adaptable generation. They're very adaptable, obviously very tech savvy. That's a generation which is deeply passionate about sustainability and the climate crisis, because they're feeling it. They're actually feeling it. Other generations are feeling it, but they're saying that This is something that was handed to me. I wasn't part of this. And so sustainability is another one. Inclusion is another one. Right. And I think mental health is also something that matters to them, right? They are not shy, nor do they see that sort of as a taboo to say that, I mean, I hear my son saying that, maybe in his lifetime, the stress levels will get so much that I may have to go and see a psychologist. And then you're saying, what's wrong? And so I think they appreciate and want to protect their mental health. Now, what can they learn from the other generations? I think the other generations, they can be a little more patient because everything they want, a matter of seconds. So patience is one. Also, when I speak to managers who manage Gen Z, they always say that, look, use technology as a tool, but not as a lifestyle. So there's a distinction where, you use a swanky app to, do something online, but do not be on that device for 14 hours or 12 hours or whatever that number that is out there. But so make sure that there is that distinction. Financial literacy is another one, I would say, that where there's a lot of debate about, okay, they don't mind living in the now, living in the today, right? But there's also a future to prepare for. So those are some of the, I would say that, just some sort of some attributes that to see the generations a little more sort of at a high level, and as well as what each generation can learn from Gen Z, what Gen Z can learn from the other generations.
I mean, there are so many threads to pull on. So I wanna bookmark this, but it's interesting that you wrote a book and you went down this pathway, but you also registered that there is not a lot of research. So how did you even make that decision? Was it just a drive from what happened with your family that pushed you to this direction? Was it the opportunity that you saw of, oh, there's not a lot of research, let me contribute to that? Because it takes a lot of confidence and a lot of bravery to even touch something that, a lot of people haven't realized or haven't been made aware of.
Yes, absolutely. No, you're correct. Certainly there was absolutely no long-term thinking gone to say that, hey, I will build, a practice out of it, if you will, or something like that. But I think the book was immediate, driven by just simply to honor my parents. But the moment I decided to do that, and the emotions were so high at the point that I wouldn't have deferred it anymore. I mean, I just took it on. I spoke to as many people as I knew from my past work, and maybe 20 different people, practitioners, faculty, etc., from around the world that just say, hey, I'm thinking about this. And what would you say? And I think the more I was listening to them, I was actually getting discouraged, to be honest, because I was experiencing my own sort of imposter syndrome about, how am I going to write something? There's so many experts out there, and what do I know? And I think that's what I had taken a simple course, which was very well structured, which helped me to say that, look, it isn't about, if you're not going to make a kind of a well-researched quote unquote academic kind of a book, just look at your experiences. I think that will be much easier to write. And I think that became much easier for me. So I put down, like, what are the things that we can share in every chapter. I just want to share more stories than give data and statistics, because everything can be contested. And so that was that. And as I said, it grew slowly. I learned many things about the book business. You have to eat, sleep, and drink your book. But beyond that, I think I was just seeing that there was a lot of curiosity. People were enjoying it. People were happy about it. And the TED Talk happened. That gained a lot of popularity. And then came the podcast, which was honestly, I would say that I probably learned more from others on than and people claiming that, hey, I'm some expert, but where they brought their dimensions into looking at the various facets of Gen Z. So here I am. I mean, I see that this is a generation which is going to be talked about at the workforce for at least minimum 7, 8 years, if not longer, and at least in the Asian context, because it's a very young demographic. In some societies, like you have a slightly, the curve is going the other way. But so I see that, and then hopefully we can just create enough value that end of the day, it's not about how big you make it, but I think you're touching and giving solutions to people and companies and clients, right? So you're feeling good about that.
And I want to make eye contact with something, otherwise I feel like it's going to dog the conversation. But when we say Gen Z, what demographic are we talking about? Gen Z in India? Are we talking about Gen Z in America? Just North American, like Western Gen Z? Like,
Yeah.
are there differences here? Is it similar across the board? You're smiling, so I'm guessing
Yeah,
this is a
no, you're
juicy,
right. That's an
juicy question.
excellent question. Ayush. So I think, again, the more I got to learn as I was asked to talk various dimensions, I think the deeper I was forced to go, and after the preliminary level of research I had done. So this whole notion of how generations were defined, again, it's a Western philosophy or a Western school of thought, which has been, and again, it's not wrong, but I think if you look at the term boomer, the boomer term is an American term, it doesn't even exist in some parts of the world, right? It came from the fact that there was the World War II, and America was slowly getting back up on their feet, and more affluency was happening in families, and therefore larger families, and that's how they got the term. But we've taken that, and we've kind of, so, but the concept of generation remains true, which is to say that yes, if we take certain number of years, if we look at the common events, can we all relate to that? Can we say that, hey, growing up, I was very happy to watch that sitcom, or we used to watch this, or we used to do that, right? I think that remains. And what also remains is that those are the foundational years. And so every time now, Ayush, if I'm given, if I'm invited to give a talk, and let's say if I'm doing an audience in, let's say, some part of Asia versus say Africa versus India, that context really gets different, right? So I gave you the example of the boomer generation in India, which was actually very different than the boomer generation in America. So obviously, we've, to your question, the age or the years have been kept same, 97 to 2012 roughly. But I think there is a local context which drives some of what has happened. Now, overlaying, because of this generation, they're so connected, the technology is the common denominator. They've all experienced, like I look at my son, my nephew, right? They know all the sitcoms that my cousins in America are watching. They know of all the tools. They know of all the sports, right? They know the sporting icons. So I think technology has bridged that gap. And many of the events, everybody today, because we're so connected, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the climate crisis or the energy crisis or the fake movement or the Me Too movement, right? Or the pandemic, right? Every single person was affected by the pandemic. So in some sense, there are some events which were global in nature, which apply sort of to all Gen Zs. But then you're right, it is a little more contextual and local.
Right, so technology is the common denominator, which is a brilliant way to put it because that kind of connects every Gen Z's experience being in having technology within an arm's reach, using social media from a very young age. As you were saying, baby boomers, like the term technically only applies to folks in America. Like it only makes sense. Whereas in other parts of the world that maybe didn't win World War II and have an affluent family and country and have a lot of kids, like that term doesn't make sense. Which is fascinating. You just, again, as you were saying, podcasts teach you something. So taking this technology as the common denominator and applying that to the workplace, how does technology's effect and hold on Gen Z affect their workplace behavior?
Sure. So a lot of the work, Ayush, that I do, again, when you think about training or leadership development work, right? I think I just take 60 seconds to kind of lay this out because it's important to then justify how technology can be utilized. So for example, in any leadership development program, we're essentially trying, there are four levels. The level one is when we do a program and you make an impact, and how was that experience? The trainer was good, the food was good, etc. Level two evaluation is where you can check with the participants to say, hey, do you now understand what was taught in the class before and after? And so you can kind of do that through exams or things like that. Level three and level four in the consulting, in the leadership space and in the training space are the hardest. What's the level three? Level three is the shift in the behavior. So I may have taught somebody, hey, how to manage difficult customers, but does that mean that their behavior is going to shift when they go back to the job. Well, they may try, but it may take some time. So maybe 6 months from now, they're becoming better, they're becoming more customer friendly. It may reduce the number of complaints, and that takes us to level 4, which is basically that impact or the indicators that I have on the business. Now, why do I say this? I say this because technology is a great enabler for all of us in this space at level 2 and level 3, which is to say that for a Gen Z, look, like don't give them a 40-page case study, right? Instead, like say that, okay, how can we give them short bite-sized assignments to check something post the class? Or how do we make sure that they remain engaged and they don't forget everything, let's say 6 weeks out. And so that's where I would say that technology can be brilliantly used, right? So you use community tools like Slack and other tools where they can form a community of their own. You can use videos as a tool, just as short videos for them to consume before, after, as refresher and so on, right? And I've seen companies, just to give you an example, there is an ERP company called SAP. You may be familiar with them, right? SAP. Now, SAP, what they've done is that they've kind of utilized some of these simple tools, technology tools, which are popular with Gen Z. So, for example, TikTok. What they found out is that the Gen Z attention span, they don't want to read an annual report. They don't want to go and see and click, 50 clicks to see, the website. Instead, they're happy to see a TikTok video. So the senior leadership of that company basically created 40 simple videos of 2 minutes each. Okay, telling what that company is about, telling the values of the company, telling the value proposition. And therefore, it immediately catches the Gen Z's attention, right? So I think there is a lot of positive in how we can use technology. I think in my space, in my work, I say that it's an excellent way to use that as a support mechanism to help make that change from level 2 to level 3. And there you have the data, right? You can take some of that data and share it with the clients and say that, you know what? Well, we simply made 6 connections already in advance. So there is no excuse to say that they won't show up, or the fact that if they didn't show up, we can say that, look, we did our part, right? And that's how you can justify to the business saying, okay, what's the ROI on the investment that you're making? And I think so that's how you can use technology.
See, immediately when you even go there, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but when you go to the place of, oh, we have to make TikToks to help Gen Z, or we have to turn this 40-page case study into more accessible, into a more accessible document in order to cater to Gen Z's attention span. I totally understand the argument from older generations and the pushback of, guys, just like we can't cater to you, you cater to us. You're the employees, like you have to adapt and conform. So
Yeah.
is like how do we work with that dynamic of older generations want to be more traditional and more conservative, not in the political way, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
conservative in how they do things, but Gen Z are more, I don't want to say tech oriented, but more progressive and I guess a little more stubborn to not adopt the old ways and to just do it the Gen Z way. You don't have to understand it. I'm just going to do it and I'm going to be successful doing it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think you said it right, Ayush, where I think one of the ways in which I draw the distinction between Gen Ys and Gen Zs, that I say Gen Ys accepted technology, but Gen Zs expect technology. Okay, so that's the distinction. And I always say that there's a learning curve for the other generations, and there's enough stories by way of where some of these things, if they're not I mean, if there's a way for us to kind of manage that, then you can avoid the conflict. Then you can even harness the power of multi generations, right? And I've seen where the Gen Z is responding via text in the night, and then someone doesn't respond, but responds via an email in the morning. So I think what works. Recently, last year, I was invited in a conference where I had to speak on the hybrid way of working, and I think what companies have realized is that it's best to have, I think, a simple kind of a communication guideline, if you will, where we can say that, okay, you know what, if it's a client kind of communication, let's be professional and shall we do it in an email versus a voice note. although in Asia, I must say that I think, I mean, today business is done on WhatsApp, and it's just the way things have gone. I don't see my son even like when he gets on a call with his friends, he doesn't even they don't even take the time to write WhatsApp messages. All about voice notes. So I don't know. I think the more advanced the technology becomes, I think the positive is that they're actually learning it and leveraging it the most. But that does bring a gap among the other generations, right? And I think it's a two-way thing that I think we have to say that, look, if can the Gen Z appreciate the other generation's context, can we on this side help them kind of move upstream, if you will? And for the most part, but companies, you're right, companies do have to keep this in mind. There is I want to use the word, but there's a huge turn off for Gen Zs when they see that if a company is a technology dinosaur, that's just they have turned them off. They feel like, okay, you know what? I don't think I can survive this long. And so I think there is a learning on both sides. Anyway, yeah.
So I want to turn this question on its head because if I'm part of an older generation and I see this, let's call it for what it is, a proclivity for Generation Z to kind of take advantage of the non-tech savviness of older generations. We talk about companies being tech dinosaurs, which turns Gen Z off. But as soon as I feel like Gen Z come into company cultures, and please correct me if I'm wrong, they kind of take it over. Not as like not as like a malignant cancer cell. I'm part of that generation, so I don't want to speak badly about, my people. But it's like, again, we are very stubborn, and I don't really care if you understand why I'm marketing in this way. I'm just gonna do it this way, and you're gonna accept it, right? So how would you recommend Gen Z kind of deal with the inability for older generations to, adopt this expect technology attitude. Because again, as we all know, as you know, Gen Z grew up in technology, whereas other generations adopted it. And so
Yeah,
our minds, our ability to understand technology,
right.
where we
Yeah.
expect it,
Yeah.
is very different.
No,
It's
absolutely, Harsh. And so you're right. I think there's a kind of a ripple effect, if you will. And I really have to acknowledge and admire your candidness and self-awareness of being self-critical of your generation in a good way, right? Not in a bad way, about the downside of too much technology or a device, right? We've seen enough. I mean, there's enough out there that says that get away from being FOMO to JOMO, right? The fear of missing out to joy of missing out, right? And there are these detox camps and whatnot. So I think Gen Z is also kind of getting a taste of their own medicine in some ways because you're overdoing some of that. But one of the ways, Ayush, that I do a couple of things at workshops and I ask companies to do it even afterwards is that we do an exercise called the assumptions audit. And so the assumptions audit is essentially saying that, okay, if you and I are working together, we're in different generations, you may see a particular behavior of me at one point, and then you just wonder like, why is he doing this? And I may see something of you, right? And rather than reacting at the time, what the teams are asked to do is that, okay, can they come? This is intact teams who work together, right? So some frequency that they feel which would work for them, they would come back and then kind of just share to say that, okay, um, so let's say, for example, I will say that, you know what, or let's say you're making a remark on me saying that I think you, because you're senior in the room, you're quick to dismiss the younger people in the room. Now you're just saying the observation. You're not telling me its interpretation. You're not telling me, you're not extrapolating that to say that, maybe because I have too much technology on my hands and you think therefore I don't have much to think about or whatever, right? That would be the interpretation, right? And for example, I could come back to you and say that, Ayush, like I see like a whole lot of the people in that room are not inviting some of the more experienced people because when it comes to innovation, you don't want us in the room. That's an observation. So you can share that observation. Now, if you interpret it as saying that, you know what, he's on the other side, like what ideas is he going to bring? And that would be the that would be the justification. So what we do through that is that we ask each generation or each team with a diverse group of sort of demographics to look at that and then have a conversation to say that, okay, what, and maybe bring that out and say that, okay, in this situation, what was going on in your head, right? Well, what was the remark about? And I think that helps us to bring some of these stereotypes or some of these things that you're talking about, and technology being one of them. Like I've seen a lot of times where someone is talking and you're on a device, like, so the immediate reaction would be, why is he being disrespectful, or is he like not respecting what I'm saying? Am I not making sense, or am I boring, whatever it is. It could be that like maybe he's taking notes on the device, right? So I think we can carry assumptions both ways. And so I think we use exercises like that, where we try and bridge that. Another one very quickly I use is also what I call describe, interpret, evaluate. So I just tell them to describe a situation, interpret the situation, right? So let's say, you have a situation, you interpret it. But then I ask you, you have to come up with an alternate evaluation. So you only tell me like, okay, how else could we have solved this? In this situation, you're pointing the finger that this went wrong, but what's the alternative to that? So you're then being forced to put into the other person's shoe and see from their lens, if that makes sense, right? So again, this it's a process, right? And I think the more we can harness some of that, it just brings. I think there's a lot of positive in my view, but yeah, we have to be patient on both sides and kind of see how we can bridge this gap.
So, if we were to extrapolate the trends that are going on now and look to the next 2 to 5 to 10 years, what are some of the things that will happen in regards to Gen Z moving up in the corporate world, Gen Z moving up in academia, Gen Z interacting with, other generations as well, becoming more ingrained in their careers? Do you see, is it more positive? Is it more negative? Is it all just interesting?
Well, no, I think there is always a school of thought, what's kind of the doomsday. Oh my gosh, this, that's what they said about narcissists of Gen Ys being so narcissistic, right? Which is saying that, oh, they're so self-centered. A lot of times, what tends to happen is that what I call is that there are meta stereotypes of each one of us, which is almost to say that the popular belief about what exists about that generation or of that individual tends to drive the behavior than the reality, right? Which means that in reality, perhaps it's not. I mean, look, when we grew up, we had our parents from a different generation. You have parents from a different generation. I had, so it still worked out, right? I think it all worked out, and some of these phases of life, like when you're a teenager, when you're in an adulthood, right? They're common across, right? Everybody wanted to be a little bit rebellious, and they wanted to try new things and do things. They did something stupid, wanted to hide it from parents. So there is that. So I don't think it's a lot of gloom and doom. And I think same thing with Gen Ys, where uh all the hype about Gen Ys that it's going to completely change the working landscape. I almost see that, the Gen Ys are now saying that about Gen Z, saying, we were the more mature one and we were the more settled ones. And, forget about, people criticizing us. Look what's ahead. So I always think that, that chain will likely continue. I think the Gen Z may feel that, we were given a hand, but, I mean, like you are going to step on the pedal even more with technology. Imagine the Gen Alpha coming out in 10 years. I mean, just today I was watching how ChatGPT is now, you can talk to it and it solves a problem, right? So, where will that lead? But I think things have a way to work out, right? So a lot of it is, it's context driven. We will see that the values will be shaped by that. And I think that only means that as the world becomes more volatile, like the stuff about pandemic, the stuff about climate crisis, the stuff about other things that we kept hearing prior to the last 3, 4 years are happening now. So this generation has a real real legit reason to say that, you know what, this can extrapolate. So I think a lot of our own context drives some of that. So I don't think it's gloom and doom. I think every generation has its kind of time and place in maturity and where they see it, and they know that, look, it's their turn now to
Right.
harness someone underneath them, right?
Okay, so let's make the conversation a little more gloom and doom since we're all happy and preppy right now. So one of the reasons, and I'll push back a little bit, simply because right now we're undergoing massive political polarization
Yeah.
all across the world. Many wars are being fought. Our addiction to social media and to other substances is at an all-time high. Depression is at an all-time high. Um, and even environmental collapses of carbon in the atmosphere, ocean acidification, coral die-offs, antibiotic resistance. The list literally goes on, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
so this didn't exist wholesale for other generations,
Yeah.
right? And I don't mean that in like a Gen Z complaining attitude,
Yeah.
or in just a I'm just stating it matter of factly. Obviously, baby boomers were coming off of a world war, and wars were being fought. The Cold War was at an all-time high with other generations. But the massive compounding list of global dire circumstances was never this present. And I'm not just asking this from a stress point of view, but for any Gen Z, it's like, how do you even begin to focus on your career to try to get work done if like the future seems so bleak? I guess my question is like, how do we grapple with this, global circumstance and then apply it to the workplace? Do workplaces have to talk about, sustainability and social responsibility every day? Do they have to make that really clear for Gen Z? Does Gen Z have to be more adamant in the workplace of solving these problems? Like, are these trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're look, I think it's a pretty good sort of devil's advocate view on the other side, and I would say that, look, that there is truth to, I mean, a lot of what you're saying, in the sense that we're all, it's all out there for us to see, right? We don't have to, go into a library for it. Like, we just see it every day, morning to evening. And so what I am seeing is that, yeah, it's, as Simon Sinek says in one of these videos, like, I think the workplace and the personal lives have, the lines for them are blurred, and therefore, like, work is entered into homes, and we don't know, like, what is home, because you could be dialing it from wherever, and what is workplace. So I think this whole thing about you could be connected, you could be, I mean, it has taken a toll, and I absolutely agree, Ayush. I think there is sufficient evidence. I know people who are in sort of the counseling space, and psychotherapists and things like that, and they're saying that, some of the younger generation, and again, just we're talking about Gen Z, that they've lost the ability to even socialize. Like, they feel stressed about meeting people. I mean, it sounds very bad, but that's just what, it has come to. And therefore, even the importance of, as you say, of building relationships. So I mean, if you compare, I'm sure, like, maybe, you look at your parents or someone, like, I remember my father would always call up people just to chat. Hey, what's going on? And I tell my brother that, we have the best devices. Like, how often do we talk? And I know that my father used to always talk to his brother. Like, I'm not making this up, but every single day, like, the younger uncle from America would call to his elder brother. So I think relationships have taken a back seat. Stress has entered the life in ways in which we haven't been able to kind of manage. So they've become, the generation has become much more fragile
Mhm.
in that sense. And I think, as Seneca said in one of his, that I think that emotional presence is required. So he talks about, like, if you're having a bad day, then you just sort of, you're sitting and showing that to your boss, which is not expected, but that's a function of what he or she is going through, right? And so whether right or wrong, good or bad, that's just the context. And so what I say to the managers is that let's appreciate I mean, let's be mindful of what they're doing, right? How can we help in them in that situation rather than being critical? I think they've just been handed a set of cards, right or wrong, right? And they've been handed a set of cards. Like, what can be the manager's role, the boss's role? And so I think, for example, sustainability. I've known companies who go out and try and get people who are deeply passionate about the environment, the earth, and they just invest because they want to make a good name. And they actually, their focus is only on Gen Zs. I don't think they can sell that story to a Gen Xer saying, hey, what, would you want to, kind of do something? I mean, they'll do it, but Gen Z is saying like, look, I really want to do something, right? I think inclusion is another place where I see that managers being very, very sort of sensitive about, how can we kind of keep that in mind? Things like reverse mentoring, things like shadow boards, all of that is happening as a way to engage and support the Gen Z. And more companies are making really honest attempts where reverse mentoring is working. So you find out what's inspiring them. So there is you're right. I think I mean, at prima facie, when we look at everything, is as they say, in the Mahabharata, that the Kali Yuga, the bad times are there, and only the Lord can save us. But look, I think we've managed, and therefore, I have a sense of optimism in the sense that yes, it won't be easy. As my son often says, you know what? In my lifetime, I've seen my friends, or I'll see my friends getting divorced, not once but more, and they're quite okay with that, and they're quite matter of factly saying that you know what, it will just happen, which was in the early generation thinking it's a sacred thing. How can that ever happen? But I think that the level of tolerance, as you say, the level of tolerance is shrunk, right? And so what it means is that how can we help that generation be a bit more resilient? How can we help them to be create a bit more safe space for them? And how do we remove the barriers? And I think that just requires good leadership, Ayush. I totally believe that. I think there are enough stories where if you can just do that, I think there is so much to harness. And I just feel that yeah, I think there's more positive that can come out of it. I don't know if that answers your question, but I still came back.
No, no, it answers it and more. Two wild cards are influencing and Gen Alpha, and I guess I'll touch influencing first. I think this is one of the biggest, strangest occupations that Gen Z and some millennials actually partake in. It's already being automated by artificial intelligence, so I really don't know how long it's going to last. But have you come across any research, any interesting facts about businesses engaging with influencers, about Gen Z's proclivity? I know that the generation ranks this job as the number one thing to do, which is horrifying, um, but also kind of speaks to their psychology. So, like, how do we deal with this influencing culture, and where should we go from here?
Yeah, no, excellent point. Excellent question, Harsh. So look, I think the marketeers are sort of in a dilemma in the sense that, okay, how do you to think that, okay, this is a generation, their behavior patterns, consumer behavior patterns haven't emerged. They've emerged. And I think what are the ways in which we do it? So you look at Gen Ys were the first ones who were always the ones who were saying like, okay, they want to look at brand recommendation, they will look at reviews and things like that. And so it's kind of built from there. But this whole influencing culture has gone to the level where like, where it as for if I'm a company, I'm thinking that okay, it's best for me to get like a top cricketer in India, and if he's got 90 million followers, like who better to kind of push my product, right? And it's very it could be that he or she may not ever use the product. Now that's the side that I think, as you say, is the danger. And what I say is that for the Gen Z, the influencer, the microblogging, all of that is making sense because they can relate to the user-generated content by the celebrity or the influencer, right? And they can relate to that, and that is how they see that, okay, if it makes sense to them, then maybe I can see how I get I get attracted to that brand. But I also say just as much, perhaps more for that generation than anyone else is the need to do the homework and the critical thinking, right? Because we're living in a time, Ayush, where there is, I mean, such massive amount of data coming every nanosecond of our life. Like, I mean, so how do you grapple with that, right? I mean, for every good story, there is a data that says, oh, but this is, just for example, I mean, we had there's a brand called Bournvita in India, which was a very popular drink growing up, and it's actually a Cadbury product. For the longest time, they were pushed by a lot of celebrities, and all of a sudden now they've come under the scanner because of the amount of sugar that they kind of said that it was versus what really was. And therefore now all of a sudden I'm saying to myself, well, that's bad because we all fell prey for it. But what happened to the people who were endorsing it and also the people who followed them? Right. And I think that's kind of what you're saying is that the influencing culture has gone to the level where I always say, pause, do the homework. I think Gen Z is right in their fair ask of saying that, yeah, I want my experience to be unique. I want my experience to be convenient, right? I think that's pretty fair to ask. I want my experience to be consistent, right? I think as long as that happens, so, for instance, if you travel in a train, like back in the day, the train service was, India has a very good train connectivity, but they've really modernized the train. So, for example, if you're in a train and if you see that, hey, there's some dirt on your seat or something is not dirty, something is not clean, you can actually tweet, and within 30 seconds, there's going to be a reply back saying that, hey, by the time you reach the next station, someone's going to come and clean that. Now, that kind of an experience will actually attract a Gen Z to a train journey, right? Because they're seeing immediate kind of response to that. So I think there is a lot of basic expectations that brands have to cater to, like convenience, like the first authenticity, all of that. But I also say that be careful, be in doing the homework. And just because you have X number of followers, right? And the downside again, Ayush, is that uh, unlike other media, digital, I mean, if you look at traditional form of media, in the digital media, right, you don't, how does one correct themselves? They just go back and forth. There's more trolling, there's more defending, there's more trolling, more defending. What next after that, right? That doesn't solve my problem, right? And so I think the critical thinking here is maybe the obvious thing to say, but I think we're living under massive amounts of data and how information gets fed to us. So I think that's the one thing I would say we must do our homework there across generations.
So we talked before about these meta stereotypes, which kind of self-enforce, reinforce the behavior of culture. So when looking to Gen Alpha, how do we, there has to be some balance in doing some research, extrapolating from data, but also kind of not corrupting them before they've had a chance to experience culture by themselves. Do you see any, that's a bad question, but do you see any potential for Gen Alpha to make a difference? Because the reason I say it like that is because, they experienced COVID at 3.
Yeah.
It's like they were given, if Gen Z want to complain about being handed, the deck of bad cards, like look at Gen Alpha. They weren't even handed a deck. They're not even playing the game. So
Right.
how should we be thinking of Gen Alpha? Should we be worried? Is there an opportunity
Yeah.
to teach the generation?
No, excellent question. And I think I think Ayush, that's squarely something the Gen Z generation will have to deal with and think more. And I say this just in fun, but I mean I say this in the context that if you look at the work demographic, like if you're an Xer, right, you got probably a 15-year runway ahead of you. If you're a millennial, you probably got a 25-year runway ahead of you. So if I'm in a meeting today, I'm likely seeing X, Y, and Z. But you fast forward that out even 10 more years, right? Who are the people who are going to be in the room? It's going to be Y, Z, and then Alpha. And then you're getting to a stage in 10 years or 15 years, right, where the millennials are sort of saying that, okay, our time has come. They could extend that runway, but I'm saying what the two generations which will have to work, right? It's sort of like the Y and the Z now, the Z and the Alpha, right? So can the Z generation appreciate the context of what's forthcoming for the Alpha generation? But again, look, I say that with time, a lot of the work that I do, with senior leaders, I see that it is also about sort of how do I say? So we do a really good activity called the River of Life, where we talk about, okay, you tell me all the critical milestones of your life and what leadership lessons did you learn, and it could be your mom or dad or whoever from childhood to the professional working years. And I always say that, okay, you could be 45, and then can you tell what does the river look like from here onwards? Which means that how do you want your legacy to be? And so I think that's where most people are caught off guard. And I also ask when we're doing this to say that, would you think that someone else will have your name as part of their river of life?
Mm.
Does that make sense? So let me just repeat, would you think that you would feature on someone else's river? And I think as Gen Z becomes into middle managers and senior manager roles, I think there will be that form of leadership coming into them, and to say that, in other words, here's a group of generation which is unique. They have the technology history with them, right? But I also say that as you see, them leading more teams, working more and more with, different generations, when you think about late 20s to 30s and so on, right? There is also an element of how can they create a leadership shadow. In other words, what can they do which will impact the next generation? So in many ways, it comes down to that. But you're right, it won't be easy. As if I ask my uncle, or if I ask someone from my elderly generation, they say that, what, I'm glad I won't be even around. I don't know. That's your battle. You fight that battle. But jokes aside, I think I think it will be a lot of hard work. But again, I always say that it should work out. It would work out.
So I guess one of the most important and last questions, but what advice do you have for Gen Z to assume these leadership positions, not occupationally, but I guess culturally, socially, and societally? How
Yeah.
do we, as young people, think about leadership? What is leadership to you? How do we, yeah, just how do we assume leadership positions without corrupting ourselves and other generations as well?
Absolutely. No, fantastic. Look, I think oftentimes, Ayush, we confine ourselves to really limit the definition of leadership, right? And therefore, I always say, go back to that example I gave you a minute ago, right? Some of our most life transforming lessons may not have come from, that professor from an Ivy League school. And again, no disrespect to the professor or the school or anything, right? I mean, we probably, if we were lucky enough to go, or we've gone, you would have grown and you would have done well in life. But I'm saying that I think the simple way to think about leadership is that you're impacting someone at all times. And I was very struck by a statement. Again, I just was very happy for my son to say that, because if you look at a country like India or some of our Asian countries, right, where there is the demographics story is so complex, and you see the extreme rich, and then you see the middle class, the poor. Well, one of the things that he said is that, Dad, you always remember that someone else is living your dream. In other words, you may complain about that, I wish I was there. I wish I could do that. I wish I had so much more in my bank balance. And therefore, he's saying that, so there's always someone, you're very fortunate to have so much that you have, right? So I think in many ways, I think for the simplest way for the Gen Z to say that, look, you don't need a title, you don't need to be called an SVP or someone, right? You're making an impact already as a leader, whether it's environment, whether it is inclusion, whether it is anything else, right? I think what can be compounded is that if you can get a good mentor who sees that in you, right, and nurtures that, And to me, that is probably what we want to create more of: good mentors, good leaders who can create more leaders, right? And but two other things I will say, just Ayush, as a way to close out, is that I think the way the world is going in terms of, you asked that question about the doomsday and all of that, right? I think the way the world is going, the two very essential competencies which are going to be very, very important for every generation, but also for Gen Z, is the first one is learning agility. In other words, they will have to quickly unlearn a lot of what they've learned, as are the other generations are doing. And I think they've been put through like a Mack truck over them, right? Because there's so much that has happened over just the 4 years. Like, I mean, so where do you do it? But I think the more resilient and emotionally strong they can become and can be self-aware that, look, the more I can be agile in learning. So in other words, you asked the question about alpha, right? They may need to unlearn many things of their life. I don't know. I mean, 15 years from now, and adapt themselves to lead Gen Alpha. So I think learning agility is going to be a very crucial competency in my view, which is going to drive that. And COVID taught us that, right? Because we could say that, hey, I could be the best pharmaceutical student, but that doesn't solve the problem. I had to still think about how am I going to price the vaccine. I have to think about how am I going to ship it, who's going to get it, what's the communication strategy. So I think more and more people will have to look at problems from different dimensions. So learning agility is something where this is where I also say the Gen Z will have to be careful and not become impatient, because learning agility requires you to go back a bit before you go forward. And that can be very frustrating, because you can quickly say that, you know what, I think I'm going to give up. But that's where you let go of the learning curve that could potentially be coming into you. So the learning agility is one. And second, I would say it's curiosity. I think with so much gadgets and so much technology and so much being kind of brought to them, we just want that every generation, but even the Gen Z generation, that they don't lose this spark to kind of, be curious about life, curious about, why this is happening. And so those are the two, in my view, and there are more, but we've got two very essential competencies, which I think every Gen Z every generation, right, they should try and work towards.
Yeah, and it's important for someone like yourself to not only acknowledge these, but also make us aware of them, because it's better for us to find out about them now and then work to implement them in our careers and lives down the line, rather than finding out down the line and figure out how to rework it into our careers and lives. But Nikhil, this has been just an absurdly detailed and great conversation. I think we've only scratched the surface, so we'll have to do a part two on this. But where can we find you online?
Yeah, so you can, again, I'm not on too many of the platforms, but the one that I am very regular or active is LinkedIn. So you can simply look me up on LinkedIn. Of course, there is a website there as well. It's learnwisely.in, which is where you can find the work that I do. You can find chapters of my book. You can find information about the podcast. The podcast is called Working with Gen Z, and that's available on all the platforms: Spotify, Apple, Google. So go check it out. But more than anything, look, I say I'm a curious learner. So Ayush, what's next is I'm going to learn from you. We'll have to plan for that. We'll do that next.
Absolutely. Well, Nikhil, thank you so much for this conversation. Hope to see you soon.
Okay, take care. Bye.